somewhat elaborate process, so.
All right, well, I think that what we should do is be sure that we have one of these that would stay with the village clerk with the application, so that if the public, wants to come in, because we're not gonna be closing this hearing tonight.
That's right, so
And
we
so
can
we
distribute
can-
this and then
We
give
can
it to Jeff.
distribute the one copy, and then it'll be available
Sure.
during business hours for the public to come and review everything that we're looking at.
Great.
Yeah.
I don't know who wants to see it, but here's a copy, you can pass around.
Here's the 64, by the way. This is from Matt Francisco. And,
Right,
and,
so
and
let's look over
if you look down, if you look here,
Right. So, if you
Right
look at
there.
the other corner of this, the left corner,
yeah.
that's where that split is. I
So,
would really, trust me, I would really like to say that that property was split in '63. No questions asked. That would have been great, but it wasn't.
you're saying that
And
that
the fact is that
left
we
corner-
have to disclose that because we can't have it come out down the road.
Yeah, to be clear, this is the county clerk's records. They have,
This is the
Yeah.
map, yep.
what's that?
So you have it not on the map. You have it somewhere else, you're saying.
Oh, I don't, what do
No,
you
we
say?
have it, Matt found them,
Went to the county clerk because it was not, what I had asked during the first application was, please show me, that it was presented to me as a subdivision. And frankly, if the planning board created a subdivision in '84 that was non-conforming, then the planning board owns some responsibility to allow that use if they're gonna create the lot. So what I had asked the attorney was, fine, show me the subdivision map, and we can't meet until I see a subdivision plat, because, were my board to do that, I don't think we would, but you could put notes on it and say, okay, no development or whatever. This was a weird conveyance because it was the distribution of an estate. It was conveyed through an estate. It's a testamentary transfer of property. According to the county records, the lots had always been 2 lots and had been under 2 tax bills. The conveyance in the deed was a testamentary conveyance of a will, right?
Right, that's
So
right.
in the county records, they have, but things happen, right? And it could possibly be that something else happened, but there's no evidence that anything else happened, and only evidence that it didn't happen. Because you could get a letter basically saying that you want the tax bill to be split, but yet nobody did a correct subdivision, a correct and formal legal subdivision. None of that exists. So on the '64 tax record, they show them as 2 separate lots. And the '84 conveyance was, I guess the family couldn't agree or didn't want to get along, and so one went, the house lot went to the son, the garage lot went to the daughter. And the note at the top of the property tax appears to be misunderstood to be a subdivision, when it's actually a testamentary conveyance through a will. Now that's all open to further research, but I will tell you, the attorney at the time did not object to that, did not dispute it. The county clerk says there is nothing in here that indicates these lots have ever been anything but these 2 lots at least since 1964. The '64 official tax record, you go with the big binders and the clerk's office, that's the record.
Right.
So if
I think
We just didn't happen to uncover that detail. So
What's that?
We didn't happen to uncover that detail in Carmel. So if you have that, we'd love
It's
to see it.
the county clerk, just go, it's the '64 tax map.
We went there, we just didn't, that was not what, we were given a tax map that also has that date, but has this correction, has this update from 1984.
I think that it's being discussed now and it's sort of been presented in as evidence. We should have a copy of it at this point,
right.
other than just on
Yeah, no, we'll get, we're.
That'd be great, I mean, I
because
would
it's
love,
being
We'll
discussed
print this
in
out.
the open hearing.
because all we
And,
could do was photograph it in parts, they wouldn't let us copy it, so I don't have a copy of the entire map. We just took photographs of all the bits.
Yeah, that's all I do too.
I think that
I just wanted to
the only thing
you can get
that
pretty decent.
we want to say, you used the term 1984 subdivide. Planning board in 1984, there's no record of any subdivision of this property.
Nor does the county
planning
have
board.
anything.
Right,
So-
but somehow,
And even if it-
somewhere, it was divided on a
But
tax
even if it
lot
goes
map.
by will
Right.
and testament, you only gain what the grantor's giving you. So whatever
Well, it has to exist, right?
right,
A will can't subdivide property.
right.
A will can say, you get this piece, they get this piece. A will can't, isn't land use, right? So they had to have already been separated for then one to go to the Tanza and one to go to Perpetua. Could be right at that moment, don't know, but there seems to be no indication of that. And like I said, the official tax map, the 64 tax map, shows them already as two separate parcels, exactly as they are today.
John?
Just, what's the relevance over, I thought it was always undisputed that there were two separate tax parcels when zoning was created and they were owned by the same person.
No, see, they're saying that those two separate parcels didn't exist when the zoning was enacted, and that it came in 1984. And that's a whole horse of a completely
okay.
different
Yeah,
color. And so,
Right.
in a way, it really is. So that's just something that why we're
So
trying to
this
nail
is
this
the
down a
new
little
twist
bit.
from the last application.
Right.
And that's my question, in that is all this, all this record of lot size and subdivision, is that just to get to whether or not, it's an honest question, just to get as to whether or not you have lost your small lot protections? Because at the point of zoning enactment in 67, if two contiguous lots were held in common ownership, then they lose their small lots protection. These lots were held in common ownership, according to the tax maps, according to the tax records. So they lose their small lot protections, right? So that's a very important piece. But as John said, when this was discovered, because where I started this with the applicant at the first, with the attorney, with Hilpert, I said, I can't meet with you until you show me this 84 subdivision. I don't know what's on the plat. The plat could say, hey, you know what? Perpetua wants to put her boat in this thing, and we're gonna put notes all over it to say no development ever, right? That's one way I could see somebody creating a non-standard lot in 84. That's a stretch. So I said, we can't meet till I see the subdivision plat. Was never provided, I kept asking for it. So finally I went over to Carmel myself, asked the county clerk to pull the file, to pull the records, and there's the 64 tax map that already shows the two lots. That was communicated back to Hilpert at the time and to the applicant. They never disputed it. That then means that the small lot protections are not in place because they're a common ownership. When they're contiguous and in common ownership, they don't need small lot protections because the point of zoning was to phase out small lots. And while you can talk about the prevalence of small lots and their aesthetic beauty and any of those other things, the reality of it is that is not zoning's opinion. Zoning's opinion is to phase those lots out. So the prevalence is not, in my opinion, a legitimate argument for their existence or their continued development and use. It is to phase them out. It is in fact the opposite argument, which is the need for zoning and the impacts of zoning to phase all those lots out. Further, and more important to this board, the Zoning Board of Appeals, it then illustrates how many people, based upon what decision is made here, could then come back to this board and say, I need variances, right? So the prevalence is actually, in my opinion, cutting the other way. Yes, they're charming, yes, they're very elegant, but the transfer of fire and life safety and stuff, we don't build things the same way. So I think that,
We're gonna
yeah.
get to all of that.
Okay.
We just wanted to nail down a little
Yeah.
bit of this. For now, let's agree, there's a question
Mhm.
about some of your,
That's fine.
not, how your history is with what these lots were, and we're going to be running this down in the next couple of weeks.
But let me ask one quick question.
But I think what we should do is, you finished your statement, right? And you're done, so we have questions from the board,
Sure.
okay? And then once we have questions from the board, then we'll go to the public, okay? So, questions from the board?
Yeah, I just had one question for Matt, just so that we're on the topic. Where does it say in the zoning code that where two lots are owned in common and they're substandard?
The small lot.
130.
it's-
One-
134,
Yeah.
19,
L,
L.
There, that's it. I just wanted to put it in the record as that.
existing non-conforming lots, section 134-19L.
Okay, I just wanted it read in the record since it's part of the hearing.
And
When they're held in common ownership.
There's also a reference under 134-7C.
All right, so that's all I have.
All right,
I have a question. We haven't talked, and sorry if this was covered in a previous meeting about this, but we haven't talked about the house on the other side on Parsonage. So I know that it's very close to the lot line, but how close is the existing building to that house?
Sorry, which,
it'd be the house to the west.
to the west.
No, to the north.
To the,
well,
The house on-
northwest.
See, the thing is, we don't
To the right.
have surveys of these things. We could foil, kind of randomly foil properties and get the surveys, but that's not public, public information. So we would have to
What is your
foil or
question about
obtain
the
that.
house?
I guess it's just in, it's,
Mrs. Voltage is here. Mrs. Voltage is right here, it's her house.
okay. It's
Could be.
I'm trying to put this into the context. We've talked a lot about its proximity to the house on Pine Street.
Yes.
I just was curious
You wanna
about,
know exactly between where the barn is to her house or to her property line?
I know that, right?
Okay,
Because
so
we
to
heard
the
that
house,
from the property
we
line.
could always measure it. I got a tape measure.
It's not 10 foot, that's for sure.
Okay.
It's the driveway.
It's a, oh, there's a driveway.
A narrow driveway.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Eric? No questions. John, any more comments right now?
Not right now.
All right. We could have members of the public who'd like to speak. Anybody would like to speak, you identify yourself for the record, your address. I would urge anybody who feels, had comments on this, lives in the neighborhood, wants to get it out, now's the time.
Okay.
And if you could all spell your names for me, please.
Right.
Thank you.
They can stand here, is that?
Yeah, this is the point of a public hearing, this is your opportunity to.
And if you'd rather sit in your seat and talk and not get up in front of everybody, fine.
I have made myself a few notes so I wouldn't forget. Donna Nemeth, Nameth, 22 Parsonage Street.
Thank you.
A lot of their mentioning is about small lots that are in the village. They already have houses on them. This is a barn. It's not a house. It has nobody living in it. Putting a house there is gonna have a driveway that's gonna be 3 feet away from their kitchen. Very close to Judy's. The barn isn't tied into the water and sewer system, which they're going to have to. That's over 100 years old. We have no idea what's gonna happen there. And they talk about the variances. I know you issue variances. 1, 2, 3. They need 7. And even if they move the house to eliminate some of them, the one thing they can't eliminate is the size. Putting a house where a empty barn that nobody lives in is a huge difference. You're adding people, you're adding traffic, a car. It's just not the right thing to do as far as the residents of Parsonage Street feel. It's a barn. Nobody lives there. Nobody's ever lived there. You put a house there, now you're having people there. It's not gonna look the same. I don't care how much they make it look the way it is. It's still a house. It's not a barn. And we are totally against it. And if you do this, and someone else comes in wanting the same variances, it's gonna get out of hand. And how are you gonna say no, discriminate and say no to the next people if you approve them? You might as well get rid of the zoning codes. You're talking major issues with this lot. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Sean Conway, Seanconway.
Your name I know, Sean.
Thank you. Do I have to give you my address? 18 Morris Avenue. I'm a member of the Historic District Review Board, and we've prepared a statement based on some of the conversations we've had.
Right. Could we maybe hold you until we hear
Sure.
more from the public, or do you have to get home to?
I got nothing.
Right. Any other members of the public, neighbors, whatever, would like to talk?
Hi, Sarah Gerland, Gurland, and I live at 36 Pine Street, so the house on the corner.
Okay.
That's gonna have a driveway 2 feet from the kitchen. You know, a lot of what Donna said, I would agree with. You know, we've lived there since 2001, and it's always been an empty lot, regardless of skunks and raccoons and possums or whatever, and the barn. And, you know, and we understood that it was not a buildable lot when we moved into our house. And, you know, we even offered to buy it from the previous owner, which he was not interested in doing. And, you know, an empty lot with a barn is not the same as a house with people and cars and barbecues and parties, or, you know, whatever goes there. I mean, and whoever lives there. I don't know that Sam and Marcella are planning on living there. I understood to be a rental. So it's not, you know, it's just not the same thing. I mean, our kitchen is right there, and so, you know, we open the back door, and right now we open the back door and there's an empty lot. And if there's a house there, we open the back door and there's stuff right there. You know, people, somebody sitting on the deck, or, you know, it doesn't have a lot of windows. And I don't necessarily have an argument with the design of the house and the size or anything like that, but it's just the fact of it being a residence is completely different than, you know, what it currently is. And it's not really something that we want right there, so.
How did you come to understand it was not a buildable lot?
Just in talking with previous, who was the previous building inspector?
George Tompkins.
George Tompkins.
George Tompkins lives he lived across the street, right?
He was just down the street.
Just down the street.
From us.
Those
yeah.
were communications with him before the purchase?
This was years ago. You know, in talks, because we had spoken to him, we had talked about it, I guess, because Brooks Banker was always making a lot of noise about, oh, I'm gonna build a bigger house here, blah, blah, blah. I was saying, no, you're not.
Brooks Banker was the owner at the time
Yes,
of that lot, 21 Parsonage.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And,
And
you
you
know.
approached him to see if you could buy it.
Mhm. Yeah, a couple of times, and we never could quite make an agreement. And at one point, he even decided to sue the Vitanzas, who had sold us our house, because he said he was sold this lot, you know, under false pretenses, and that he's not allowed to build on it. And he was, right, because it was illegally subdivided, he said. And so he had a whole big story that he was trying to spin. I don't know.
Your intention of buying it was not to construct a house, it was to use it as a big backyard.
Yeah. And perhaps, and also probably to preserve the barn, and perhaps turn it into a, you know, a shed or
Right.
art studio or something like that. But that would have been our intention, but it didn't happen.
Thank you very much.
Travis Biro, I live on Parsonage.
What's
And,
your
I guess
last
my-
name?
Biro, B-I-R-O,
And what's the address?
9 Parsonage. And I mean, I walk past it every day. It would be nice
Where's
to.
9 Parsonage?
Top of the hill,
Okay.
so the same side of the road. It's not, his plan isn't any smaller than a lot of the houses on there, that it wouldn't change the look of the road as far as I'm concerned. And it just sounds like there's two sides of the opinion, and one is to defend a empty, abandoned lot, and one is a house full of people having fun and living in it and being a part of a community. And I mean, like, yes, obviously there's gonna be a larger footprint of people using the house, using the space, but it sounds like a much more welcome use of the space than what it has been for so long. And it seems like the lot was subdivided with some sort of intention. It seems like the current owners have all intents of kind of preserving not only the aesthetics, but they're not building some big monstrosity. They're not looking to do those kind of, they're just looking to use it. And I think that's much better than what it's been for so long. I think it'd be great to see an improvement to the property, like you're suggesting.
Thank you.
May I add something to his comment? He lives at the top of the hill. He's not directly affected by whether a house is there or an empty barn. As these people are?
Well, my neighbors, so 7 is 10 feet away, and 13 is 8 feet away, and it
But
doesn't
those
bother
are
me.
houses that have been there.
I understand, and unfortunately,
To the chair, please.
yeah,
I'm sorry,
We understand what you're saying. And
But-
we understand what you're both saying.
okay.
Anything else? Okay.
Hi, Thomas Huber, I'm at 36 Pine Street also, Huber.
I'm
And-
sorry, once again, I was,
Yeah, Thomas, Huber.
thank you.
And, you know, I'm interested in the subdivision, obviously. We've been told a number of things. Last time was that it was divided, and now that's in question anyway. But I'm curious to know that the one separate lot, 21 Parsonage, how is that in the tax code now? It's not a residence, and has it ever been a residence? I believe it's always been either a stable or a garage. I believe the tax paid on it is not of a residence. So I'm curious if it was ever a residence, that lot, historically.
You're asking whether there was ever a residence on 21 Parsonage Street?
Yeah, or if it was ever,
Did anyone ever live in that?
assessors classified it.
yeah.
Right.
Oh,
The assessor's records, I don't know.
To my knowledge, I don't think the assessor's ever classified as a residence.
No, I don't.
Matt,
think
I know you didn't find anything like that, and I don't know, you
No,
guys
and
went
it's-
through all the,
And it's also taxed at the rate of an unbuildable lot. I think it's a seventh of the value of your land. The land only value, the lots are almost identical in size, but that lot has, I think it's a seventh of the value or sixth of the value. So the assessor understood it, you know, to be unbuildable.
Well, I don't think that it's unbuildable, but unbuilt on. It's a
Right.
311 lot.
This
It's
is
a
no,
311 lot.
no. This is the land value alone,
Mhm.
not the improvement. It's not about improvement. It's just the land value. So your square footage that you buy, not the improvements upon it. Certainly, if you put a house on, it's worth more. The land value has a separate value in the assessor. So if you look at the assessed value for the 36 Pine versus the assessed value for 21 Parsonage, they are starkly different.
Right, I'm just talking about, when you look it up on the Putnam County tax record, it is listed as a 311 site, which means
listed
unimproved.
as a what?
311, Is the
311
designation.
site, which is,
just unbuilt. It
It's
doesn't mean unbuildable, it's
Yeah.
unbuilt.
Unbuilt.
That's the language in that, if you
I
look
think
it
what
up.
Matt is saying, what,
The land
you
value.
understand what you're saying, I think what Matt is saying is that the assessor taxes the land of 21 Parsons Street less than the land value of the house next door.
Of course, and understood, I was just correcting the
Okay,
language.
all right, I understand.
And just out of
Clear on the
curiosity,
language.
Yeah, no, go.
no, similarly sized lots, say, is the current lot of 21 Parsonage, without structures on it, or say a primary residence. If, you know, vacant land, would it also be perhaps just 1/7 what the, say it was a primary residence on 21 Parsonage? I mean, who know, I mean, you're saying, Matt, that this current piece of property has 1/7 of the assessment value?
That's by memory. It's starkly different, yeah. But that's the only, assessors understand whether or not a property can be improved or whether it can't be improved. That's the land value.
Well,
John
just-
can speak to this.
The
I'm just-
assessor's taking into consideration that it doesn't, it's substandard.
It's substandard, it's not that I mean, just what I'm
I
asking,
think
I
that's the,
mean, one way
that's
to,
the key thing.
what is an assessor's head when they assess it at 1/7 of the value? I don't know why, but by looking at other similar lots.
Because you can't just go to the building department and get build a house on it. They have to go through these variances,
Right.
and that's why
Got
the
it.
value is lower.
Okay.
And I had one other question, which was, and then I lost my track. Of the lots in the village that are smaller than this and have properties on them, of them, how many of them what percentage of them were grandfathered, and what percentage were built after the
zoning.
new zoning?
I mean, there's been no evidence on that.
We don't know.
We don't. I mean, the answer is somewhere it could be found, but, you know, the information's out there.
But I think the point the applicant's trying to make is the community character impacts, that's one of the factors you look at. So they're arguing that there are already so many substandard lots that the community character will not be impacted as much. Not necessarily that they're pre-existing or if they got variances, I mean, that certainly would help if some of those lots had obtained variances, but I think the overall point they're trying to make is that there's plenty of substandard lots with houses on them, and that goes to the impact or lack thereof to the community
Yeah,
character.
one bit of information is not a death knell, I mean, because we go through the 5 criteria, except for if we further explore the notion of whether or not it was a subdivided lot or not, or with regards to this 1984
Yeah,
situation,
that's
which
all
we,
new to me.
yeah, so.
It's a new issue.
That is the only thing that's open and up in the air. I understand your point that what the whole PowerPoint was with regards to, which was a tremendous amount of work to point out how Cold Spring is set up and the number of substandard lots, you know, cross-compared.
And that's what he was trying to prove.
Right.
What do you say to the town fathers and mothers who were on that trustee and mayor back then in 67 or whenever, and when zoning code was approved in 67, and they made this requirement that lots should conform after 67, and they said that the ones that don't, they've got 6 months to put something on there, or else you're out of luck. What now, essentially, nothing has happened between then and now. So what do you say to that board?
Well, first of all, 6 months, as you know, is a really short period of time to design and build a house, right? So that's the first thing I would say. That's like holding a gun to your head, right? Because you gotta come up with the money, you gotta get a plan, you gotta build it.
Well, let's
That
assume that they
So
filed a building
that's
permit.
what you asked, what my comment is, that would be my first comment. My second comment is that I really believe, from having gone through the code update committee, which you were also on,
Yeah.
and, you know, looking at these different issues, that code was really written for the areas of the village which were undeveloped. I don't think that they were, you know, they may have said, okay, well, you gotta build or get out, but I think that lot, honestly speaking, and that's what I'm not doing this because of Sam, that lot is no different than a lot of lots in the village. And
Why
from a
did
legal
the
point
code
of view,
update
it might
committee
be
then
different.
not change the zoning to more conform to the sizes in the village?
Well, so that was one of the things we
We
discussed
did
in
the
the
code
code
update
update
committee
committee.
leave the dimensional requirements for lots as it is now?
We did for a reason, which
Mhm.
was that in order to make, and we discussed this like for days, right?
I'm old, I
Our-
forgot, so tell me.
What's that?
I'm old, I forgot,
Yeah.
tell me.
Well, it may not have been you, I was on it for almost 5 years, I
Yeah.
think, so it, you know, it's been a lot of water under the bridge. But we would have had to come up with different, like an R1A and an R1B, and we would have had to go through the village and do that. We would have had to actually create a new district, which would recognize the historic district, and it seemed like it was just gonna be too complicated, frankly. That was the reason that we didn't do it. Not because it wasn't desired. The comprehensive plan is full of requests to make the code consistent with the built condition, right? That's one of the things that, now that code update committee work has been transferred to the village board of trustees, that's something they're gonna have to think about. Is it right? Because, you know, we have these conflicting requirements in the village, right? Historic District Review Board wants something to look in a certain way and fit in a certain way and have a relationship. And the code doesn't do that. So there are inherent discrepancies. And I think the purpose of that code was really to address, you know, marathon battery factory, right? Isn't that really what it comes down to?
Wouldn't they have said that in the code? Wouldn't they have said that, wouldn't they have, because they have all kinds of exceptions in the code, all kinds of them. And I'm finding them every
But
day.
not lot by lot,
Yeah, but
not lot by lot.
why wouldn't they have said that in the code when they wrote it, that, you know, we're talking about unbuilt lots, not new ones? I mean, not existing ones. Why wouldn't they have said that?
For the same reason that the code update committee this round decided not to do that, because then you'd have to go through and identify individual lots. The point of code is to look at general issues, right? R1 district, these are the
No, they could have
requirements.
said, any lot that's unbuilt on in 1967, going forward, has to deal with the code. But the existing lots that existed, that are undersized, what you're saying is that they would be distinguished from new lots that would be subdivided and created after 1967.
That could be the case. I mean,
That
all
would be
of
the
this is
simple.
pure conjecture, right? Because now that you or I can go back and
Right.
think about what was in their heads. We can't even look and discern from the code now why the 50 by 50 square was added, not in 67. It came through much later. Why was that added? You couldn't
Well, you
figure it out
see that
either.
in a lot of other codes, and we've talked about that before, and they did that, so you don't get a code, you don't get a lot that looks like a voting district in New Orleans, you know, it goes all over the place. So you
Yeah.
have a lot that is made, that it generally looks like something that someone could build something on, as opposed to some contortion. That's why they do it. And it's not like the 50-foot square thing was picking on Cold Spring. It's in almost all municipal codes. So it doesn't come from nowhere.
Yeah, no, in the village of Cold Spring, it seems particularly inappropriate. That's why I think that the code update committee is recommending.
Maybe the
removal.
size of it is particularly
Right.
inappropriate.
And that's what we talked about, because it doesn't really relate to a majority of the lots in the village.
All right. What do you say to the neighbor who says, you know, we've got a, there are threshold variances here, and the threshold variances are whether you can build on this lot. So there's, you know, we don't even get to the area variances required to allow the barn to be where it is, to be rebuilt where it is, before we get to the first variances, which are, can you develop this lot? So we had one of your neighbors talk about the amount of variances, and I think other people are gonna talk about the extreme amount here that we're putting on this one, we're writing variances for on this lot. What do you say to them?
You got another hour? I mean,
You're a very brilliant man. I think you can do it in 2 minutes.
No pressure.
yeah. Well, I think it's an exceptional lot, clearly. I mean, we think of it as this, I mean, you know Joel Shapiro, right? I mean, Joel Shapiro, when he puts an object down in a completely empty museum room, he puts it in a place that it completely occupies that space, irrespective of anyone entering.
There are no people in it.
Again,
No people.
nobody's living there.
I know, and one thing I would say is that I know this myself. I've been through it and I've had to experience it. Change is not easy. Change is not something
A
that,
barn is
we-
not a house.
Okay, let's let, all right, so now we'll get to,
Thank you.
Architectural Review Board.
So I sent,
Give us some history. The applicants came to Historical Review, District Review Board.
Yes.
Just set the table for us.
okay. I'm gonna read the statement. It's included in the statement.
All right.
So this is specifically discussing the side setback, the front yard setback. And I will also just mention that this reflects the views of the majority of the board, but it is not unanimous. There's 5 people on our board.
Do we have a breakdown?
No, because we don't have to
Yeah.
vote on these. So,
3 to 2?
so the Historic District Review Board has met several times with the owner and the architects of 21 Parsonage Street in regards to the reconstruction plan for their barn or their stable. As they have not yet formally submitted an application, these meetings have been workshop sessions, and therefore our discussions do not constitute votes and are not binding. It is our understanding from previous ZBA communications and from the owner's presentation to us that demolition and new construction on the site would require variances for side yard setback and front yard setback, among others. We encourage the ZBA to grant these variances as they will have a profound impact on the historic context of the barn, as well as on the primary structure to which it has a historic relationship. While we have not conducted our own research on the property based on our knowledge of the village and the era, we can assume the existing barn was always intended to relate primarily to the corner brick structure facing Pine Street. The barn's formal presence on Parsonage historically was and still is secondary to its function. Its proximity to the street and sidewalk on Parsonage suggests its historic commercial/industrial purpose, just as most of the storefronts on Main Street met the sidewalk. Therefore, to require the structure to be moved back to create a deeper setback would create a disconnect between this historical structure and its utilitarian use and aesthetic, as well as its relationship to the primary structure. Most of the buildings in the immediate area of the building do not meet the front yard setback requirement. Shifting the barn back as the existing code requires would create a false relationship between it and the residential structures to the west on Pine Street, thereby disrupting their own historic context. Lastly, to center the barn on its lot, ignoring its relationship to the primary house, would create an illogical story for both buildings. No working barn would have been built in the center of a yard, preventing the yard from acting as a functional space, just as no barn with any service capacity would be located so far from the roadway in an urban context.
But now we're changing it from a barn to a
We're
house.
changing the use.
Right? Right?
May I finish the statement?
Okay. Sorry.
The
I couldn't
HDRB
help
finds
myself.
that the proposed siting of new construction on the same footprint of the historic structure to be the most and only appropriate position on the property. We respectfully request the ZBA members please consider the specifics of this property, its context, and this building topology while you review this application.
Thank you.
Okay, so I didn't hear anything. Talk to, now, it's not a barn now, it's a house.
But the architectural form that's being pursued is that of a barn, of an agricultural building. That's what's going to be, when Paul spoke about creating a memory building, that's the memory, its relationship to the barn and to the stable.
How's the historic review board view where you take a structure and you basically, you might be mimicking the dimensions of the structure, but you're basically almost eliminating much of the original structure? How does the
Well,
historic
it's
review
something
board
that
speak
we,
to that?
of course, like everything else, look at on a case-to-case basis, but in some cases where a historic building might not necessarily have fabric, which is of significance, the elements that remain significant are the scale, the size, the materials that were used. So there's lots of things that can support the continued use of a building.
Do you think somebody going by, visiting Cold Spring would recognize, oh, that, you know, once it's rebuilt, would say, oh, that must be a very old structure? I mean, is that what
I think whether, assuming that the
Well, like would
the
they say
quality
that
of
has
construction
historic value?
is exemplary, I
I'm
would
just
say that
curious.
people would potentially say either that is a building which has been renovated and modernized, or they will say that is a building which is taking its inspiration from perhaps what was there before.
Yeah, because you mentioned, I'm just working with what you talked about, that there was a tectonic relationship between that and the other building. Would somebody recognize that driving by? That
I would recognize it,
Okay, yeah, I'm just
and
asking.
two of my colleagues probably would. I don't know if it's, I mean, if you're asking whether the people who know the village and know the area would recognize it, as opposed to,
I mean, I think in its current state, it might be recognized that way. You know, or they would find it a curious, sort of, again, structured building and obviously aged. So
Yeah.
there you can sort of relate it, but now you
Certainly.
change it. But I'm just trying to understand it from the historic, board perspective and what you're trying to preserve or not preserve, and whether it's something that really looks old, or would people really tie in those thoughts that you're saying, once you change the appearance. I'm just asking since you
yeah, I
guys are
think
the
if the
experts.
proposal were to build a ranch house, we wouldn't want it to be, perpendicular to the street and tucked into a corner. But the fact is, the reconstruction of the building is going to maintain so many of the forms of the existing building. So it, with modern materials and with some updates, it will still maintain that relationship to the building on Pine Street.
And also.
And this is also based, again, on workshop sessions that we've had with the applicant. So we are not discussing anything to do with the final finishes or anything like that. This is the opinion of our board as it pertains to the siting of the reconstruction as it's been presented to us so far.
But I'm just working with the information that's been provided to us today, as you can see you were here.
Mm-hmm.
And so these questions just sort of come to my mind. And I think they sort of present as questions, when you see, the differences in what they're trying to do and relate it to the next building, and whether that would actually be achieved if you just restructure the building, even though it mimics the shape and size. That's all you're trying to understand, whether the common person would recognize that.
Carolyn,
Yeah.
state your name, so I'm sorry for the record.
My name is Carolyn Bashan. I live at 24 Parrot Street, and so I'm speaking both as a resident, a visual neighbor, as well as a member of the Historic District Review Board. As a close-by property, when I get up in the morning, I look out my back windows, I see the rear elevation of the barn. I kind of like it. It's kind of career-nized. But as a member of the Historic District Review Board, I want to bring up a couple of topics that Paul brought up and Sean brought up. One is the idea of this as a memory building. I think I brought up that term in our last workshop meeting. From a strictly architectural concept, that idea is attractive to us. And certainly, the design approach that is being taken here was extremely well received by the board, and that I believe was the majority of the board, simply from a design point of view. But we have to take many other things into consideration once we get into an actual application and reviewing it under the criteria of the review board, and considering also the U.S. Department of Interior Secretary's standards for treatment of historic sites and properties and buildings. At this point, since the referral to us stated that this was a disassembly of the building and rebuilding, and since it could be a disassembly and reconstruction, depending on how much of that fabric is reusable, or it could be a demolition and building a new building, and we don't know where that is. So it could be a preservation situation, preservation treatment, a rehabilitation treatment, a reconstruction treatment, or a replication. And at this point, we don't have enough information to do that. If all other things were equal, zoning considerations and planning considerations aside, if we're only looking at the historic context from the Department of Interior Secretary's standards, certainly in terms of siting and neighborhood context, what Sean referred to is absolutely our view, or the view of the majority of the board, including me. But we have a lot more information that we need to seek before we can actually review this application.
What's the barn status in the historic district? I know that when we talk about, for instance, some buildings are contributing, there's a record and they contribute to the district, and they say some buildings don't contribute to the district. And some buildings, there's not one or the other.
Right.
So where is this in relation to that?
Well, number one, it's in the local district, which I believe is also the state district. There's actually 3 levels of district in Cold Spring. There's the local, which I believe is contiguous with the state district. And then there's the overlay of the national district. This is in the local and possibly state district.
It's not in the higher level,
It's not in the national
Main
district,
Street,
no, but the Secretary of Interior standards are advisory to all levels. Okay, I mean, the Secretary of Interior standards under the National Historic Preservation Act specifically address situations where there is federal funding or other approval or action involved. That's that section 106 process. But, you know, those things kind of flow downhill so that we take those types of things into consideration. In terms of contributing, the only documentary evidence we have on that was a consultant study done several years ago, which we still have in draft. We have never formally adopted, which stated that this structure was contributing because it was within the significant era of the district. But that document also said that it was endangered, that it was nearly in ruins. So while there has been an assertion that this building is not structurally sound, and we know it, I'm sure it does not have a certificate of occupancy, for example, for any use. Or I'd be very surprised if it does. It certainly isn't a compromised status.
Seems to me it's fair to say that the least that will happen is that wood frame that we see, that mortise and tenon frame, will be in the new structure. It might not be used as load bearing, but it'll be there.
We think it could actually be used as load bearing
It
structure.
might be used as
Yeah.
load bearing.
We could.
I think it's probably safe to say that the existing siding on that building and the existing roof shingles and the existing roof sheathing is gone,
That's
okay? So I think, and you're probably gonna find that it's a rubble stone foundation, and, which is gonna be substandard for the basement you're gonna build. And the floor structure is, I don't know, what is the floor, dirt? Probably, right?
It's typical for the period,
Right.
so that
So-
means it was hand-hewn logs that are flattened on the top, let on
Okay.
grade, and then,
Alright.
and sheathed on top.
So the frame would be replicated inside the new building one way or the other, maybe load bearing, maybe not. The new siding, the new roof,
Yes,
the windows, the shutters, all that is gonna be new material.
that would all have to be currently code compliant.
And you've got insulation to put in and all that kind of stuff. So you're gonna wire it up, you're gonna put plumbing in. Okay, so we're talking about a mortise and tenon wood frame. Okay, which is not an insignificant thing, but that's what we're talking about, I think. Okay.
And I
And
also
as well as the form and the shape.
The form, it strikes me that the form is not a lot different than most houses in the village. It's a 2-story with a gable roof, you know, and literally, and I'm not advising anybody to do this, but if you put double hung windows in there and put curtains in the windows and put a front, people would go, oh, a house in Cold Spring.
Right. I mean, you know, the national guidelines always speak about how you want an accessory structure to relate to its principal
Right.
structure, right? And that's the roof slope. It's not an accessory. And that's the shape of it, right? I mean, when you look at those two and you compare those two, that's how they relate. It's, and they weren't both brick. I mean, if you looked at that Sanborn map,
Right.
one of the things I didn't point out was that 36 Pine is obviously brick. The only brick structure in that area except for the one across the street. So brick was not a common thing, right? And you wouldn't build, unless you had a good deal of money, a barn from brick.
I didn't answer your question earlier or respond to your comment about referring to it as a barn or a house. It is the opinion of the Historic District Review Board that the original architecture of a building as it relates to its use is what we strive to maintain even if the uses change. So just because what was always a house becomes a dentist's office, we don't require it to somehow now look like a hospital. So in this case, its barn, its history was as a barn. Whether it's adopted to become a residence, we are more concerned about maintaining its connection to that architecture.
Right. But I think what we're gonna be concerned, and what zoning code is concerned about is things that portion of the built structures that people live in, residences, and the buffers between those people, especially in small little villages with small little lots. And so when you have a barn, and the neighbors have pointed this out, when you have a barn, you've got one type of occupancy. And then when you have a house, you've got another type of occupancy, a completely different type of occupancy. And so if this board crossed the threshold and said, okay, we can make this a lot that will grant the variances allowing building on this lot, and then we start to talk about area variances, that's where the mixing of an historic form structure in a certain site on the lot, now changing it into a house, that it is occupied as a house, is that same position on the lot defendable when you have to put cars on the property and people moving around and lights and all that kind of stuff? You know, and I think you would agree that that could trigger different site planning issues and requirements. And I think the neighbors have pointed some of those out. Kathleen Foley.
Although just along that line of thinking, say that this lot is an anomaly in the district, one of few properties in the district where that much space exists between buildings. We live densely in a dense village. It's a sort of a Christmas present to have a large empty lot in your backyard. Most houses around the village are,
So Christmas is.
we do live cheek by jowl here. And the building itself is an exception on the lot. And I think part of considering change, whether this were being proposed as a gas station or a barn again, or a store, all of those uses are different in a neighborhood and constitute change, and change always creates discomfort. I don't live on the block, so my impact isn't the same. I live very close to the Shields on one side of me, you know, see each other through the kitchen in the morning. Right now, what we have on that lot, and I think one of the neighbors raised a very good point, we have a lot that is currently a missing tooth and has no life, missing tooth on the block, no life. And we will lose this building, and we will lose this fabric in the district. We will lose the accessory form and structure if something isn't done with this building. And so the question becomes, do we allow that lot to become a fully empty lot and a real dead space on the block, or do we allow a use that maintains vitality that is consistent with all of our dense housing around the village?
That's what you would say to the prior board of trustees in 1967 that brought zoning
I
into the
suspect,
village.
Donald, that I don't know what they were thinking,
But I think
but
that's what you would say.
I
Sounded
suspect
like an
that
effective
what they
thing to say.
did was take a suburban model of a zoning code and say, we don't have the capacity, you know how we work in this village, we are all volunteer boards and we all put in huge amounts of time. I suspect that they were handed a code by an attorney and said, make this work for Cold Spring. They got to a point with it. We wouldn't be able to build this village today. The village we love, we could not construct under our existing code. I think we got the code because that's what communities all across this country were adopting in the late 60s. It is meant for a development that would look like what Constitution or what White Hill looks like. We can't have our village under that code. And it honestly, it does disappoint me some to hear that the code update didn't go, although I know it would have been years more, that additional mile to say what really is the character defining feature of our side yard setbacks and front yard setbacks, and how can we better reflect that so that we can maintain. We go through this question every time in the village someone wants to put on a porch or make an addition. We have to say to you all, not us, we look at the design, but you all have to say to them, okay, how can we accomplish this with this suburban mode we are asking you to build in? What do we have to change about this code that doesn't work to make your porch happen? That's what your job ends up being, because our code doesn't allow space for the village we actually have.
Right.
So,
I'm
two
sorry.
comments to that, one's appropriate.
I forgot your name, I'm sorry.
Donna
Right in the back.
Namath. I understand what she's saying, but these people all bought their houses knowing that they have a house close by to them. They bought their houses with the understanding that that was a barn, it was always going to be a barn, and nothing was going to change.
But can you always expect to be able to walk out your back door
It
and
was-
enjoy the splendor of someone else's property?
That's irrelevant. You're
Right.
again talking about something, you bought your house
Okay,
already knowing there was a house
both
next
points
to
well
you.
taken, both points well
The
taken.
lot is too small to have a house put on it. A barn is not a house. It doesn't have people living in it. There may be a few four-legged creatures living there from time to time, but it's not a person. It's not a car parked 2 feet away from their kitchen window.
You might have
It's
rabies.
not having to deal with, like Sarah said, a party or a barbecue or whatever else may go on there. People living there is a big difference from an empty barn.
Got it. Paul,
Oh, thanks, Stephanie.
Stephanie.
Well, I was gonna just ask, Stephanie Hawkins, 15 Cabot Street. I know Donna has been saying this in other words, but I think that I think this is a very, very interesting design, and I enjoy the very compelling narrative of the dissertations about this, and how the buildings relate. I think that the question of the relation of structure to 36 is, I think that when you introduce the residential use and the impacts, it changes that relationship. It isn't as it isn't as accessible, I think, to people. And you were making the point where, like, John, would people see would people see the, what is it called?
Architectonic.
Architectonic, the plate tectonic. And I appreciate that and how the structures relate. I mean, right now, it does appear to be in relation to 36. But with this fabulous contemporary design, it changes the relationship. And to me, walking by, I wouldn't necessarily see that relationship anymore. Part of the relationship is the rustic quality, the age, and sort of the similar in age, and how the yard is not used as a deck with it. There's no chimney on that garage now. And so when you start adding those uses, you start introducing impacts, and it's not just this like, wow, that's very cool, Architectural Digest rendering. It's filled with people and these, cars, and so I think it actually does change, and the use of it as a house does, to me, kind of mitigates the argument, or it doesn't make it such a compelling argument anymore to use it. I mean, I really think it's a great.
I just want to take a moment. We've gotten 2 correspondences that I know. One is from the Historic Review Board, and that's been read. And there's another letter, which I'll read now, and then we can keep going. But I want to make sure I don't forget to read it. It's from Catherine, how do you pronounce that?
Stang?
Stank? S-T-A-N-K-E. Where does she live?
Pine Street.
All right, Pine Street. I don't see her address on here, but, okay, she lives on Pine Street. To the Village of Cold Spring Park, 32 Pine, okay, so I strongly object to the following specific variances from zoning code for construction of a single-family dwelling on a substandard lot. 1, the lot is 3,360 square feet, wherein the code requires 7,500 feet for a single-family dwelling. 2, the lot is 48 foot wide, and the code requires 75 feet. 3, request for 2.2 foot front yard setback when the code requires 25 feet. 4, request for one side yard to be 1.5 feet when the code requires 10 feet. The zoning code is in effect to keep standards within the village for minimum lot size and space between houses and garages and the street. This block is also located within the village's local historic district. I have lived at 32 Pine Street for more than 10 years and do not want any construction of any dwelling that is substandard for zoning purposes. Such a construction could possibly affect the property value of existing houses on this block. The existing, quote, barn, unquote, or garage building on this property does not meet zoning code and is an eyesore to the block, as the property is frequently left with long grass in the summer and no one actually lives on the property. It is a storage building. This block is zoned for one-family residences, not storage buildings with off-site owners. Respectively, Catherine Stenk. Friday, December 13th. Okay, and I don't see any other letters in here, but, no, that's not, yeah, that's it. Okay, so,
So
Paul.
I had 2 points I wanted to make. One was in response to Kathleen, but before that, having become fairly familiar with the Village of Cold Spring Code at this point, I would say that its intention was not to, as some people have suggested, move the village closer and closer as it evolves to look like a suburban village, right? So as we lose structures in the village, if we do get closer and closer to the description of that the code gives as an ideal, right? 7,500 square foot lot with these big setbacks and stuff. But as we lose structures, and inevitably either through, lack of maintenance or other reasons, I do not think it was the intention of the code to get closer and closer to the suburban ideal. If we had, God forbid, a fire and things were demolished, we know that the code doesn't actually allow you, as it's written right now, to rebuild. Right?
The problem,
But,
okay.
so that is not the intention, I believe, of the 67 code. Right? And the real thing is that if we do lose these buildings and we create open spaces, we won't look the way we do, right? And that's not clearly what the comp plan is about. I think ultimately the zoning board doesn't like that. Historic District Review Board certainly doesn't like that, right? But everything the comp plan talked about as far as what this village's aspiration is was about looking like a historical village, right? So by doing what's being proposed on that site, we do keep that. To Kathleen's point, there was a desire to try to address the question of, changing the code to reflect the village. One of the points and one of the reasons that change wasn't made was that it is important and essential for neighbors to be able to come to meetings and voice their concerns about new construction, because we all live so close to each other, right? Because something will be close, that's why everyone does need to be heard. And if we change the code so that it reflected, a 2-foot setback or a 1.5 foot setback or something like that, people would go the other extreme and they would always be pushing out to the limits, right? I mean, that's what, Carolyn, I've heard you talk many times about people moving up here, liking the small scale of things and then saying, there's, after I've had a couple of kids, I need more space, right? So that's the tendency. And so one of the reasons we kept that was so that, not that the volunteer boards would continue to have work, believe me, but that the public could in fact be engaged in the process of these changes.
Hi, my name is Richard Corey.
Yeah, actually,
Richard Corey,
Richard Corio, Corio,
and the address?
77 Crest.
Outside of the
Off
village.
of
Outside
East
the village,
Mountain,
What was the street?
77 Crest Road.
But his business is in the
My
village.
business is in town.
You may know it as Barber and Brew.
Just spell the name of the road you're on.
Crest,
Crest,
C-R-E-S-T.
Okay.
And like, basically, I'm here just what Paul said, like, what he just said is why I'm here. Like, I like the direction that the town is going in, like, like keeping what we have and not becoming suburban, and appreciating, I feel like the barn's just gonna fall down, and it's not gonna be there, and we're gonna lose our history, and that's why all the people that come into my shop and talk about this town, those are the things they love, and I hate to see that stuff lost. And this is only one piece of the big puzzle, but that's how you keep things like that. That's why I'm here.
Matt Francisco?
Yeah, 18 Orchard Street. The gentleman at the end said, do we have a right, what really strikes me is, do we have a right to, to interject, have we kind of enjoy another's property, right, to John? And that's really the crucial, the crux of it here is that what we do have a right is to expect that the code will be enforced, right? And that's why they look at these boards. And that's why these variances are so important, right? Because, as Paul creates tables that show you all the properties that are impacted, those are also the folks that would then watch this decision, right? And in this, so I think it is very important that and I'm sure you guys will take this with the gravity that it is, because how we have applied the code in the past and, the number of area variances that have been denied based on percentages, all that stuff will be open to review. So I think when somebody says, well, do I have a right to expect something? I think people do have a reasonable right to say that the code will be, very judiciously applied, and that all these things will be looked at. But when you talk about when you get into the aesthetics of it, like a Joel Shapiro sculpture or the architectonic relationship of these things, that's all very subjective and very experiential. What will remain are the decisions that you make and any variances that you grant. That is what will be set in stone, and that's what we will live with. The architectonic relationship, once you put the curb cut in and the cars parked there, is very different. The void between the two buildings is not there. And if somebody sets a Dunkin' Donuts cup next to the void of a Joel Shapiro, sculpture, he's gonna lose his shit, right? So I mean, it is these things. Life will happen, and stuff will happen, and something could happen on this property where I am now disabled and I now need a driveway, a garage, and I have to expand because I can't go up the stairs, right? Those are the things that you guys live with, and and I think that really is the crux of the whole issue is, that while we can talk about this thing being this piece of art and these relationships being kind of sterile and static and protected, that's not the way it goes, right? So I think what is really lasting here is these variances, and I'm not talking about precedent, I'm talking about the flip side of precedent, which is how have we enforced the code over time, and our neighbors, because they're all our neighbors, right? We're volunteer boards. They look to us to enforce that code and protect their interests and have some sense that there's going to be a predictable outcome, right?
You move into a neighborhood for a certain sense, an established neighborhood, because you've got the security, if you see around it, it's been developed, and there it is. You move into 21 to Pine Street, and you see 21 Parsonage, and it's a empty lot, supposedly unbuildable. You do make some inquiries about buying it to nail it down. But you do look at the zoning code, and the zoning code tells you, well, this, you need to go through variances to the steep set of variances to get it. So, nothing is certain in an uncertain world, but I think you're getting me to what my question to Paul was going to be, if this board crossed the threshold and said that 3,300 and whatever it is square feet lot can be buildable, and we grant the variances for that, what about some guy, there are a lot of big lots in this village, and he goes, I need $100,000, and he hires you to subdivide, to make a drawing of a 4,000 square foot lot off of his, and he goes into Matt and he says, I want a subdivision, and Matt bounces to the ZBA saying, okay, you need to get a variance for that. and then you come to us and you say, well, you did it for Sam, I want it too.
Yeah, well,
What's the
there's
difference?
a big difference here, though.
Tell us the big
So-
difference.
So the big difference is that that initial intention of that code was to protect those large lots from being divided into really tiny ones, because they've never been that way. They've always been big lots. There are huge lots in the village, right? So a subdivision of that kind would invariably have to conform to the 7,500 square feet, right? How
I'm
could that-
so,
how
I'm
could that
talking
happen?
about a lot, I'm talking about a lot that's bigger than 7,500 square feet.
No, I understand, you're talking about a this.
I'm
let's
talking
talk
about a 10,000,
Right.
15,000 square foot lot. There are a number of them in the village.
Right.
So what do we say to them?
Those
Life happens to
properties have
them.
never been as
Unexpected
dense
happens.
as
They need
that
100
area.
grand quick.
That area is dense as it is and has always been that dense. That building has always been there. It's been there longer, or at least as long as anything else in the environment.
You're talking about 21 Parsonage now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you have a large space, right, you have a large open lot in the
Right.
village.
Yeah.
If you're going to subdivide it, then it only makes sense to apply the code as it was intended. New development, new, subdivisions, then you gotta have a 7,500 square foot lot. It's one of the issues with Marathon, right? Those lots that are down there aren't that size either, right? But if you take a property like, for example, the ones on Paulding, yes, thank you, and subdivided those, you would have to conform to the 7,500 square feet. That's what I would say. That area where we're talking about, 21 Parsonage, has always been dense that way. That's its character. That's what's trying to be preserved. And I think that, Sean's point about topology, that's exactly what it is. It's got topology.
I would argue
Mr.
the
Why
opposite.
don't we identify
Oh,
yourself?
Dave Morandi, 15 Academy Street. I would argue that if I was an attorney for a person that wants to break their lot up, and we had this compelling arguments from the HDRB about our village and the density, and also Paul's argument earlier on why the zoning was created as it was, and that's really not what they meant for each area. That I can see a lot of these lots. If somebody came and said, I want to do a substandard lot, because, I don't know, come up with some hardship, I don't know. And I would find that really hard to grant, to deny that if I was bored. And I think an attorney might have a field day on that, I'm not sure. Yes, this lot's already there, but with all the arguments that are making the case for a small lot in this village, and this is how villages are, and we're a small village, and the HDRB and the comprehensive plan all want to keep that flavor, and we want to have small lots, and this is what it's like. That's, then why would you argue? Why would you not allow that, A number of other things, I just think the relationship, first of all, I've been to a lot of these planning board meetings, planning board and zoning board meetings, and I think one thing you have to remember is that the owner hires someone to present his case. Paul is here to present his case. He's here to show the evidence. He's here for his customer, his client. He's there for that, and you can't, you can't ignore that fact. Whatever Paul's saying or what Paul wants to say, whether he believes it or not, he's working to have this. The end result is to have this built. The relationship, I love barns. Barns are they're earthy. They're what they are, and that barn is what it is, and why it's drew the couple to say how romantic and how beautiful it was. It's because of what it was. It's the structure. It's the earth of it. It's the feeling. It's the part of that land. That's what barns are in Vermont, in New York, wherever there's big barns. It's the feeling that you get from them. When you take all of the fabric, the whole skin of that building up, put a metal roof on it, change all the side and paint it a different color, have windows in it, it's not a barn. I think that's the Donna's point. It's not, part of it. It's like, it's not a barn anymore. It's a residence. There's no relationship at all with that building. There's none. There won't be any. It's beautiful design or whatever, but it has no relationship. It has no relationship to anything on the street either, or age, or that period, the period of the village, as far as I'm concerned. you know, that's one point. And the building's gonna definitely have to come down. You're not gonna save that building. I'm a contractor. We all know that it's not built on a foundation. You can't raise that. You're gonna have to take all the siding off. It's just, there is no relationship. A few other things that were said is like there's open space or dead space there, but there's space like that all over. I'm not anti-space, believe me. I think the more space, the better, and the better feel there is in a village. The building right across the street from Pine Street, that brick building, that has a long backyard. I think the situation of this building is unique, but there are a lot of buildings that just in that whole neighborhood that have long backyards that have, you would call dead space, I guess, you know, and if you were, you know, I think you could argue, why don't somebody build on those if you're against, you know, open space. So, you know, it's not a big lot to start with. It could be someone's backyard. That's square footage on that. Maybe the depth not, but it's along the side of Parsonage Street. That's not unique, I don't think, in the village. I think there's probably a lot of corner lots that have longer space in them. You know, so there's a historic part of it. You know, if you fell in love with this barn and you wanted to keep it, and it's a barn, you know, whatever, that's one thing. But changing it all, you know, and showing the history of the barn and slides of, you know, barns and how the village used to look, and that's great. And I love old pictures, and I love you know, love seeing them, and I love barns in the neighborhoods. But we're not talking about a barn anymore. We're talking about a modern-looking building that's going to sit in a space that it shouldn't be really sitting on, in my opinion. The second thing is, you know, when they created, whether our forefathers created zoning, you know, with the right intentions or whatever, there had to be something there that said, okay, whoa, we better do something in this village. We need some codes people have to follow. They came up with stuff. And then they must have created the zoning board of appeals, I would imagine, because they knew that there had to be some flexibility in their laws, and that's something we don't mention. It's not like they made these so that you had to comply with them 100%. They had a zoning board of appeals, and you appeal to them, and variances are given. And that was because they knew that they had to be flexible. Maybe somebody wants to put a 6-foot fence up and there's a need for it or whatever, and they can go to zoning and zoning can say, under the circumstances, yes, that's good or whatever. But in this case, we're talking about 7. We're talking about 7 variances are needed. It's unheard of, and it's gonna set a precedent. And if you can't go by precedent, it can ultimately change the character of the village by granting so many variances. How can you not grant variances to a future applicant when you're granting 7 for one parcel? It's just absurd. My 2 cents.
You know, Paul, you know, pointed out how there are a lot of substandard lots in, you know, Cold Spring. And, you know, a lot of work went into that, there's no doubt. And Matt, my question is for you. One of the primary arguments being made here is and what might distinguish this property from others, you know, going forward, looking at it, if variants were that as are requested, could you accept this property from other undeveloped substandard lots by simply saying this had an old barn on it, we were doing it for this reason, it had some character, it was related to these other buildings? Do you think you can get away with making a decision based on that? Because there's a lot of criteria we're going to look at.
To contain it.
Pardon me?
To contain it.
To contain it.
Look, I think that, you know, there's just the general rules, just the bulk requirements, right? You know, that it's going to be very, very different. Sure, if there's a way, and, you know, and John can help, you know, speak to that. I mean, I think there's a way you could paper it to say, well, the only thing I can think you can really kind of, you know, get a hook into is the failure of the merger clause, right? And the fact that it really, if the merger clause were properly written, it would not have been conveyed separately. It couldn't have been. Because part of a good merger clause is to merge them for purposes of zoning, but also that you cannot convey them separately without a legal subdivision. Legal subdivision sounds weird here because you can't subdivide, you know, 3,000 square feet into anything legal. Legal subdivision, small non-conforming lots makes a lot of sense down in Marathon, right? There are plenty of little substandard lots, but you could take the entire parcel as one and then legally subdivide and then convey them separately. So that's if the merger clause worked and it was written properly, then that could be your solution to create lots in, you know, there. Look, you know, if you want a way out of this, and I'm not all that comfortable suggesting it, but you could look at the merger clause and say, but for the fact that the merger clause failed to achieve its goal, right? The goal of zoning, whether or not we like it, whether or not we feel it's reflective of the village character, we are bound by the code. These are what the lot sizes are. You know, if you don't like it, then get in the legislative body and start moving this stuff in a different direction. But you don't get to say, well, I'd rather create romantic little tiny homes on little parcel-sized lots. And, you need to get that into the code, right? So I think the one thing that you could hook into that would distinguish this, and John can certainly speak to this, is you could say, the property can't be brought into its best and highest use because it's now been conveyed separately and it's substandard, right? Without question, it's lost its small lot protections, right? Because it was in common ownership. Well, assuming that's the case. So you could certainly say, and again, this is really a question for John, you could hang your hat on the village is willing to trade certain things because of the unique exceptions of this application, right? That because the lot has been conveyed separately as two separate owners, right? Nobody wants a lot with a garage, right? Or, and it's in the R1 district, you could say that the village is willing to concede these things, maybe even one parking space, maybe even, these setbacks. The question is then how you can paper it that way to say that is the only reason we're doing this, right? When we do parking waivers and we talk about why we're doing something, we're very, very careful on all those whereas statements and saying, so it doesn't escape, right? Because it's intentional for this. So that's the one thing that I think you can look at to say, could you bring this thing, somebody needs to mow the grass and maintain the property, and who's going to do that, right? If they can't use the property and improve the property, right? So that's one possibility. I'm not suggesting it, but but you're asking. That's the only thing I think you could really hang your hat on, is to say, well, the merger clause failed, now they're separately conveyed, they have separate owners, and a shed owner is probably not gonna bring the property up to its highest and best use. But then you still have the reaction of these folks here to say, why do I have no protection under the code? Why can't I expect a predictable outcome, right? You can talk about, romanticize, small lots and the character of the village and all that, but we live under the code. So we have a reasonable expectation to say, minimum number of variances is 7 minimum, right? What is the past practice of the board? So I think all of it is pretty hairy, right?
Do you have any clue how many lots were still unbuilt, that had been created, that were substandard after the zoning code was approved in 1967?
That should have merged, or just the lots themselves? Contiguous lots?
Setting apart the merger clause, because I don't.
What's that?
There is no actual merger clause in this one.
There is.
But setting that aside.
Right.
There is no merger.
There's code that speaks to merger, and it's too deficient to claim a merger could have happened. Right, John?
Right, I mean, basically, if two lots were under the same ownership and they were substandard, and it's 1964, whenever the
1967.
whenever the code was created, and if they're owned by the same person, then you lose any protection. So theoretically, they should have merged.
Right.
So theoretically, it should have happened, but it doesn't necessarily
The code didn't say that, that's the
right.
problem.
The code doesn't say that they automatically merge.
Does the common law say that?
But they lose the grandfathered status. They lose all the protections because the same person owned two adjoining substandard lots.
So in other words,
So they haven't merged for deed purposes, but they basically have lost their grandfather.
Is that common law?
No, that's just how your code's written. I mean, all different
Is
towns
that how
have
it's
these
typically
types of
interpreted?
provisions.
Is that
Yes.
how it's typically interpreted?
Yes, that is how.
So in
Well, it's
1967,
typically better. I mean, we are-
36 Pine would have reacquired 21 Parsonage. Just right there, the merger clause, they would have merged. That line would have gone away.
Well, right, well, it doesn't, it's not a line with respect to tax parcels and a tax map.
Well,
It's for the purposes of zoning, the line goes away,
For
yes.
purposes
Right.
of zoning.
Right.
And for the purposes of conveyance, a good merger clause will also say, and ours doesn't even mention it, that they can't be conveyed separately, right? Because the whole point is, whether or not we agree, is to create these 7,500 square foot lots. You don't need, it wouldn't be a taking if you own two contiguous ones, because you didn't lose anything, right? You still had two, nobody had a lot that their value declined, drastically, in 1967, right? Because if they had two contiguous lots, they still had lots that could be built upon, that could be improved, right? So that's why but again, our clause is very deficient, the code update committee is working on that, you know, I've talked to Maria about it.
Would you
So-
look,
But I would
So-
like to
so
step this
my-
argument
no, let me just-
aside though, because I think at the moment, we can't really talk about it. It's because the merger clause is deficient and it didn't happen.
would you look then
No,
at,
Those two
would you
lots
look then at
are
the whole?
owned separately.
Yeah, would you look then at the whole of the zoning code to then try to interpret what the intent is of the zoning code in order to then make a decision on the issue of
Is that our
merger?
job? I mean, I don't think that's our job, I think our job is to apply the code, right, and I think that.
But what I'm saying, I'm not saying not apply it, I'm saying look at the zoning code in the context and what its intent is to do. And it seems to be to try to restrict density building.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, the reason you put in zoning is because you enact zoning is because you want predictable outcomes, right? You want established zoning, right? Whether or not that's, I don't want the, the ammunition plant next to the daycare, right? And I don't want, and all, and
Well,
the
that's
bars
uses,
next to the houses, so.
that's districting, yeah.
Right, so that's, but, so I think that like I said, the only thing I think you can really kind of get a hook into here is to say that this property has been orphaned, right? For all intents and purposes, and to bring it back into its best and highest use is very difficult. So assuming that you wanted to get there, that's the only thing I could think of. But again, then you have people on the other side of that decision saying, I don't expect this and I don't agree with this decision and it shouldn't have happened.
And that's your job, is to
Yeah.
balance in a way
Right.
the
Yeah.
impacts, the benefits.
But you
the
also look at the
applicant.
whole of the code, don't you, to try to figure out what the intent of the code is in general? I mean, for instance, I was just out in
The code is absolutely, at the point of zoning enactment, trying to phase out small lots.
Right, well, for instance, I was in Utah, and the zoning there is for area coverage of improvements, meaning structures, on a singular lot would be, the percentage-wise is 50 to 60%. We have 30.
Right.
And so, people look at, but in general, it's 30 in many counties and cities and towns and villages. So, that's the norm, but so when you look at 30 as opposed to 60, you say, oh, well, Cold Spring intended to have less density building on a property. And again, I know this goes a little bit far, I'm not sure if I can't recollect whether this structure would cover only like 20% in this case, I'm not sure of that.
Lot coverage is not
Lot coverage is not an issue.
We would have to.
But at the same time, it's where, structures are located. And so the code does try to intend, and of course, there are many historic and up and down Main Street, stores, everything up front. And there is a mix even in residential areas. So it's something that we just look at the code as a whole and try to balance out. And of course, I think this whole separate thing about merger and everything, I think we're gonna have to get advised on that and what legalities we have here with regards to the
Right.
substandard
Yeah,
lot.
Yeah, first-
again,
and
that's
first
why I
you-
would like to set it aside, because that's a separate issue.
I get
that
it.
I think
But
we've
the-
already talked
I get
about in
that.
previous hearings,
But
and
the-
I don't
but
wanna
the-
dwell on it, I wanna
But the
go to
gate, but the gating issue is whatever you believe.
I understand,
Whatever,
but
I haven't said anything. The gating issue is the condition of the lots, right? Are they separate lots, right, at a certain point in time? Did they have common ownership? If they didn't have common ownership, it's a different discussion than the merger anyway. So the question is, what was the status of those lots, the ownership of those lots, at the point of zoning enactment, right?
And so it's getting late, and
Yep.
so we're not gonna resolve this tonight. So, what I would propose to the board is that we continue this, we adjourn for tonight, we continue the public hearing to, I would say, the next would be 2 weeks from now, which would, my calendar says January 2nd. The board be here? Can the applicants be here, January 2nd?
I'm not gonna be here.
Nice way to start the new year.
John,
John can't be here?
No.
I'm not sure if I can be here.
So I think we put it to another date.
Put it to another date.
Yeah.
I don't know, what do we do, roll another 2 weeks?
The second is it,
Do we have to do it every 2 weeks, or
I
can we do it the
think
following?
we could do it to, as long as we announce a date certain tonight, then we're
Mhm.
okay. So, John, when's your next available? And in the interim, we're gonna nail down the status of this parcel at the time of zoning. I'll send you what Matt has sent me, and you can take a look at that, see what you think, and work that into your scenario.
I would like to ask a response to one thing, which was a comment that Dave made, which is I take as a personal issue, because we don't take on clients, and represent them for whatever it is their objective is. We have a lot of energy, and I think that's been acknowledged, that's gone into this, that is truly our own research in the interest of understanding the accessory structures in this village, and no one has paid us for it. That is work that we have put in here. It's not because we're being paid for it. It's something that we believe in.
I
We
get
believe
the
it's
sense
important.
that you've been doing this for a while, and then Sam came along, and you were like, wow, I'm in the same,
We had some
we have a
overlap,
common
that's
interest
right,
here.
that's right. That's right. But it isn't the case that we have been, for example, paid to do all of this work, or, that's not the case.
They're not paying
The
you?
work that we do, no, I'm not saying that, but
Well,
I'm
you
saying
just
we've
said
done,
that.
no, I didn't say we weren't getting paid at all.
Oh, you said we weren't
I-
getting paid for all this.
But facts
No.
speak for themselves.
For
and-
all
and unless
of
somebody
this.
counters the information that Paul put out, it's evidence that we can rely on, unless it's rebutted. I
Is
mean,
that true?
well,
That's the
anything
point.
he
We've
said that
provided
is,
you
anything
with
that,
larger versions,
I
so
would
you
not
can
believe
check it out.
everything that a person that represents a client comes and gives you. I mean, I would take it in, but I wouldn't say that's fact, or that it's not taken out of context, or there isn't more information.
well,
I'm not saying
well,
he's
who
being
would- who would-
dishonest,
who would
he's working
present
for something.
something-
What's that?
Who would present something in counter to that?
I think that'd be the job of the boards to actually, if there's something in question, or is that true?
Is there anything you saw?
I mean, if that's
in
true, then
Is there anything you saw there that was inaccurate?
I don't know if it's accurate or not.
So how are we supposed to decide it, real quick?
I mean,
Do
you're
we-
the board, I don't
Oh,
know.
we
If
were
I
gonna
was on my
volunteer
board, I
hundreds
would
some more
figure it out.
hours to go look up every single detail?
No, that's the relevant stuff.
Okay,
What I'm
so
saying
curious.
is that what's presented was presented in a favorable.
It absolutely.
Right, that's
It's
all I'm
like when you
saying.
have
That's
attorneys
all I'm
come-
saying. Whether he's passionate about it or not, I don't care.
Nobody's saying it's
I mean,
gospel, but it's evidence. It's something they're presenting, and
Presenting for a purpose. The end result is to
we
have
understand
their
that. That
building-
happens all the time in legal worlds, you know.
What's that?
Everybody has an attorney, and they both sound right usually. And somebody has to make a decision as with.
Says the attorney.
John, what is
So
Yeah.
so one thing, if you're presenting pictures
I
of,
get it, I get
if you're presenting a rendition of what this is gonna look like with no windows on it, no side, that's not true. That's not truly what for the public, at a public hearing, to get an idea of what the place looks like.
Well, I
It
believe,
doesn't look
There's
anything
no-
like the red barn
There's
that's
no drawing that
I
we
believe you've
represented
seen me
was
here
that.
tonight asking balanced questions both ways.
What's that?
I asked balanced questions both ways.
No, I agree. I'm not.
So all I'm saying is that I'm looking at everything, and nobody buys, everybody understands what Paul's capacity is, and we all understand the nature of the application.
I just wanted to point that out because I've been in a lot of meetings where that's not the case, where people, he has a compelling argument and people, believe that.
So the reason I'd like to point out, the reason that we printed up those Excel charts at a scale you can see, as opposed to the PowerPoint presentation in the appendix in the back, is so that you can look at it. You can look at lot width and lot depth, and you can check the calculations, even random.
What would help
It's
is-
there, it's for full disclosure, it's not hiding anything.
If you took if you could make a graphic that told the story of all those spreadsheets, make a graphic that explains it, people can understand. There are people in this world that can take a spreadsheet and they can make it, they can depict what the spreadsheet is really telling you in a graphic format. And I think that would help, as opposed to everybody going through every single line of the thing and with calculators.
But if I make it into a graph, the specific, in-depth detail, you won't be able to see.
Okay.
It-
Paul, what date? The 16th, if it has to be a Thursday. I have a meeting on
Well, it has to be the 16th
16th?
then. It has to be the 16th.
Okay with the applicant? Okay,
If we can't do it sooner, then I'm available, yeah.
16. Okay, so 7:30, Thursday, January 16th, we'll reconvene. Continue the public hearing. Okay?
So this copy should I give to you
Um,
to give to,
Can I,
should I give this to
that's,
you to give to Jeff? This
that's
is-
the one spare
Yes.
copy?
You, I have 4 up there, do you?
Yeah,
Yeah,
this
so
is the spare.
give the spare copy here and we'll make sure that it
So that's
is
just-
available for the public.
okay, so I move to adjourn the public hearing.
Adjourn, right, adjourn. Yep.
Any-
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, all right,
Thank you
now,
very much.
meeting.
Had to be way before me.
So, are we ready to close
Please,
the
I
meeting?
can't hear.
Yeah, I move to close the meeting.
A second?
That's
Hang on,
Sorry.
Okay.
Hold on.
can you, tell me
Who did
adjourn,
what?
who moved to adjourn?
I move to adjourn the public hearing. And
I second.
Laura seconded.
And then adjourn the meeting.
And then we close the meeting today.
I think we're adjourning and closing at the same time. We can do that, right?
Well, the meeting itself.
Well, then we can't, we
No,
gotta discuss it.
no, we have to, we're adjourning the public hearing to Thursday, January 16th at 7:30.
Okay.
And, do I have a motion to do that? We just have.
I
that.
move to adjourn it to the 16th,
Somebody a second?
7:30.
I second.
She seconded it.
Vote? Aye.
Aye.
Hi.
All right, now, we still have a meeting open. So somebody proposed to, close the meeting?
I move to close the meeting.
Laura?
Second.
Vote?
Aye.
Okay, done. Thank you very much.